history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. Now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and for the next couple of hours, as you might imagine, going to cover quite a bit. We're going to talk just briefly about this whole issue of gerrymandering, since it's become quite a national issue, and I think especially given the fact that many of those individuals that were Democrats in the state legislature decided to go to Illinois. In just a minute, for those of you that certainly like to watch online, either through our own broadcast or through Facebook or others, you will see that some of these congressional lines in the state of Illinois, pretty interesting, but we'll get to that. Also going to talk about this issue of an executive order from Donald Trump on debanking. That is something we have talked about before with Lathan Watts. By the way, he will be with us a week from today. Next Wednesday, he will be in studio. We'll be talking about a number of cases, some of their cases that have gone before the Supreme Court, this whole issue of debanking, which we've talked about before, free speech, and a variety of others, so I look forward to that. Then we have Nathanael Blake. First of all, I might just mention that he will be on, and we'll be talking about the issue of kind of the birth dearth and some issues related to fertility and the rest. And later on in the next hour, Agustin Forzani will be talking about the Defense Department budget. And before we're all done, again, very good commentaries, both by Victor Davis Hanson and by Stanley Kurtz, about the culture war that we find ourselves in and some of the successes that we've documented here on Point of View. First of all, those of you that like to watch online, and I know there are very few of you, I'll hold up a picture of the state of Illinois. Our listeners up there at WPEO and others know all about this, because here I'm going to show you the 13th district, which is just hard to even imagine, and then the 17th district. And I think if you can't see it, let me now use this piece written by Rich Lowry, because I think it makes the case very easily. He said, let's take a tour of the 13th Congressional District in the state of Illinois. It starts in East St. Louis, then it moves steadily north. By the time it gets to Springfield, the home of Abraham Lincoln, about 90 miles away, it takes a sharp turn to the east, reaching Decatur and finally Champaign, and as a result, ends 80 miles away from Springfield. It's a jagged, he says, narrow strip of territory with no obvious rhyme or reason as it traverses 6 counties. It's less a congressional district than a road trip. I love that line. It bears resemblance to the original gerrymander, which we talked about yesterday, a salamander-like state Senate district in Massachusetts back in 1812. Now, the point he's making is this. The only point of this newly created 13th district line was it was fashioned with redistricting after the 2020 census, and that was fashioned in such a way to gather together, as he says, far-flung Democrats to create enough Democratic congressional district. Mission accomplished, he said. The 13th district went from being a competitive district long held by a Republican to flipping to Democrats in 2022. Before I go on any further, you can see that if you had to pick a place to escape gerrymandering, I think the worst place you could go would be a state which is known for the worst gerrymandering of all 50 states. My mom, who didn't even graduate from high school, but was just full of all sorts of lines and common sense statements, one that she used quite often is, if you're a kettle, you better not call the pot black. Or we could use a different illustration. If you live in a glass house, probably shouldn't be throwing rocks, and that's exactly this case. So even though the state of Illinois, because of the census and redistricting, lost one district after the 2020 census, it still managed to draw the lines from a Democratic advantage of 13-5 to now 14-3. Yes, you only have 3 Republican representatives from the entire state of course, Illinois. And, of course, our listeners in that part of the country know that so well. And so, again, one of the things Rich Lowry says, this makes it especially inapt that a contingent of Texas Democrats fleeing the Lone Star State to try to stop what they fear or consider unfair new congressional boundaries found a safe harbor in Illinois. Next time their travel agent should do a hypocrisy check before booking a destination. It's such a great line, I just couldn't resist. A couple other things here. First of all, they do report in this article that something we talked about yesterday. The Supreme Court is taking up a case out of the state of Louisiana. This will, again, look and probably change, although never give up on the possibility of the Supreme Court to kick the can down the road. But I think this time maybe the Supreme Court will say, you know, back in 1965, the Voter Rights Act was very important because we did have discrimination in some of these southern states. This is really a little out of date 60 years later. So nevertheless, that's the case. And so we'll see where that goes. Also, he goes on to point out that since Democrats gerrymander, they too have really limited options. Even though you've had Gavin Newsom in California, Kathy Hochul in New York, and of course J.B. Pritzker there in Illinois say, well, we'll just redraw the state lines. As he said, Pritzker says he will redraw his state lines. This would require gerrymandering on top of his current gerrymander. And as we'll find out in just a minute, state of California can't do anything about it because they have a commission that actually draws those lines, and it would actually require some kind of initiative or referendum to change some of that. So the bottom line is that indeed, eventually, some of those people that have left the state of Texas probably will return, and sooner or later that will be a change brought about. Let's also just be very honest for a minute about the fact that this special session will certainly deal with some other issues. And as a matter of fact, most of the other issues were more compelling. Flood relief, if you haven't heard, we did have a flood in the state of Texas here. Tax cuts, human trafficking initiatives, privacy of women's spaces. In other words, when you have individuals leaving over the issue of redistricting, nothing else in this special legislative session, some of which is really pretty urgent, is going to take place as well. And I thought I would dig this one piece up because some people said, well, what in the world caused the state of Texas to even look at those particular precincts, those particular congressional districts? Well, it turns out that on July 7th, there was a letter from the Assistant Attorney General, Harmeet Dillon, of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, in which it served Texas with a formal notice that there were serious concerns regarding the legality of 4 Texas congressional districts. That would be Congressional Texas District number 9, 18, 29, and 33. By the way, that is the case. And these, they say, run afoul of the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. So in some respects, people said, well, this was all done because of Trump. And I'll be honest, Donald Trump certainly wanted to see if these 5 particular congressional districts he's been looking at, that he won overwhelmingly, whether they could be drawn in such a way that would at least make them competitive for a Republican. But nevertheless, the real initiative came from the Department of Justice. And if that's the first time you've heard it, maybe that's why it's worthwhile listening to Point of View. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dr. Leonard Sachs holds a PhD in psychology and has been a family doctor for nearly 34 years. He said he never saw a correlation between politics and parenting until now. He said left-of-center parents were no better and no worse than parents on average than right-of-center parents. He has now documented that children of politically liberal parents are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety and a lack of sense of life meaning and have substance abuse issues. He's noted that over the past decade, there's been an increase in what he calls permissive parents. They have been persuaded to carry out more gentle parenting because they don't want to be controlling to their children. In most cases, the children become the authority while parents try to be patient, calm, and punishment-free. His story from an article in the Institute for Family Studies illustrates this only so well. A mom brought her 6-year-old daughter into the office with a fever and sore throat. He asked the girl to open her mouth and say, "Ah." She shook her head and clenched her mouth. He asked the mom for help. Instead, the mother merely replied, "Her body, her choice." NYU professor Jonathan Haidt has been on my radio program to talk about his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. He believes that the real reason that left-of-center kids are more likely to be depressed compared to right-of-center kids is that left-of-center kids have been taught to catastrophize events, to assume the worst, while right-of-center kids have been taught to be more optimistic. You know, what is taught at home and what is consumed on social media is having a negative impact on the minds and mental states of children and adolescents. Political views and mental health seem to be correlated more than ever. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to get to debanking in just a minute, but I found this interesting quote from a group that I did not know existed. And one of the things that this whole issue of gerrymandering has done, and to be honest with you, I've written about gerrymandering in my commentaries for years, but I had never looked into this. But there apparently is a gerrymandering project at Princeton University. And of course, they, when they look at gerrymandering, have actually selected Illinois. So those of you in Illinois, you are at the very bottom of the list or the top of the list, depending on how you look at this, because they gave 2 different F grades to Illinois after the redistricting that took place. Because in the state of Illinois, for example, Republicans in the state, pretty significant. Trump won the state, didn't win the state, but won 44% of the vote in 2024. Yet you only have 3 out of the 17 Illinois congressional districts that are represented by a Republican. And so there are actually people that do an evaluation of how good or bad the gerrymandering is. And the other day I did point out to you that you have many of these blue states where there are 0 Republican House seats. I mentioned Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire. I mean, the list goes on for some time. And so one of the things we'll probably talk about on Friday is I sent some of this out to Dr. Merrill Matthews and Liberty McCarter because they'll be on our Friday roundtable. And so Dr. Matthews took the time to dig this up. And I suspect between now and then he will have had a piece that appears in Wall Street Journal, Forbes, The Hill, something like that, in which he found that there also are a number of states where there's no Democratic member of Congress. And, of course, I just mentioned some of those where there's no Republican member of Congress. And then there's 4 states with only 1 Democrat and 3 states with only 1 Republican. And so you can be, and was it the 3 that are Republican, well, those Maryland, Oregon, and Maine. So, again, you can see both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have been involved in gerrymandering. gerrymandering. But what's so intriguing is that much of this has been taking place for some time in the blue states, and it's hardly even mentioned in the press. And that's why, as we start having some of this surface, I'm going, I had no idea how bad the issue of gerrymandering was in some of these blue states. And, of course, then when they make these, I have to say, rather idle claims that, well, if you're going to gerrymander, we will, it's like, no, you already have. And now you're starting to see some people changing their minds about that. And I suspect that this is really, if you will, a preview of coming attractions. It does seem to me that there are going to be a variety of other places where this is going to take place, and one of those looks like it might be in Ohio, especially in terms of some of the conversation that's taking place, and much less. But one last point I might make is some people might say, well, I don't get this. Why didn't Republicans maybe do more in Texas, like, say, Democrats did in Illinois and New York and California? And part of it has to do with every 10 years of various groups, and in particular LULAC, that stands for the League of United Latin American Citizens, files suit against whatever map comes out from the state of Texas, arguing that in one way or another it violates the Voter Rights Act. And since they're representing supposedly the Hispanic population, they have always brought a lawsuit. So this time the Republican legislature was probably a little more tentative, hoping that this would protect them from a lawsuit. Well, they were sued anyway. And so in some respects, people said, well, why are they bringing about the change now? Partially because they were actually encouraged to do so by the Department of Justice, encouraged also by the President Donald Trump, and also recognizing that if it's good enough for the liberal goose, might as well be good enough for the liberal gander. Sometime we're going to have a whole conversation about this, because off air we've talked about how unfair gerrymandering has been, how it isn't fair to actually have, in many cases, completely secure congressional seats, where it's the registration so off the map, where it's so off the map in terms of Republican, off the map in terms of Democrat, that really there's no legitimate challenge in those congressional districts. And then just the incredibly bizarre gerrymandering that has taken place. I wish we could bring about a change, but I'm not sure we're going to see that anytime soon, because as we've pointed out before, both sides do it, both sides benefit from it, and trying to inject any kind of common sense probably going to be pretty tough. Let me real quickly talk about this executive order on debanking, because if you have listened to this program at all, maybe read some of the commentaries I've written on the subject, or even some of the articles that Lathan Watts has written, you realize this is a very significant issue. And what it is that eventually, somewhere, some along the lines, a bank decides that it would hurt their reputation, their argument, or that there is in some way or another this particular group that we do not want to provide banking services to. So this particular article reminds us that the White House is preparing to step up some of the pressure on the banks because they are going to have to deal with an executive order that will probably be coming down later this week, which would fine lenders that drop customers for political reasons. Now, we haven't seen the executive order, but the Wall Street Journal has, so that's why I give you this article to read about this. And one of the examples we talked about with Lathan Watts was a Christian group that was dropped from Bank of America simply because of the work that they were doing in Uganda. And that seems so bizarre. But you then have, of course, the stories that we've told about all sorts of individuals, those that have been involved in cryptocurrency, those who have maybe sold firearms, and as a result, maybe we can't get rid of the Second Amendment, but we can get rid of people selling firearms, or even the impact that this has had had on Donald Trump. I also, the other day, documented an impact that it had on Melania and on her son, Barron. And so as a result, you have seen situations in which Donald Trump, in his particular discussion about this, has talked about how he was dropped as a bank customer from J.P. Morgan Chase. And so his argument was the banks discriminated against me very badly, and I was very good at the banks. In addition to that, of course, I've heard everybody from Eric Trump to Donald Trump Jr. say that when, of course, Donald Trump was running for office as a Republican, all of a sudden those particular banks that always would take a phone call from them because they would need loans for various real estate projects, they would never return their phone calls. So we've seen a lot of this taking place, and it seems that what we have, as this article goes into document in pretty good fashion, the fact that you've had different organizations that have been dropped because of their religious convictions, some because they were involved in cryptocurrency companies. And of course, we've talked about the interview that was done on Joe Rogan, where this individual who's kind of one of the founders, I think he was even one of the founders of PayPal, along with Elon Musk, talked about how was it about 24 of his fellow friends were debanked in Silicon Valley in that regard. So we'll see where this goes. But what I thought was so interesting is even in this particular article, J.P. Morgan Chase obviously wants to say, no, we really, what did they say? The spokeswoman said this way: the bank doesn't close accounts on political reasons, but we do agree with Donald Trump that regulatory change is needed, which is a nice way to say, yeah, we probably do it. We're never going to admit it. But yeah, you're probably right. If you can help us deal with this so that next time one of the people on the board is trying to get us to debank somebody, we can say, no, we have to follow what actually is part of the executive order under Donald Trump. So we'll see what happens here. Over the last couple of months, banks have been trying to head off any kind of action from the federal government. They've been meeting with Republican attorneys general and updating their policies. And so we'll see, because under Trump, banking regulators have said they would stop assessing banks for what is called reputational risk posed by their customers, which is oftentimes the justification for debanking individuals. This has been happening in England for some time, and it's been happening in the United States. And so wanted you to know that help might be on the way. And if you are with us next Wednesday, we will have Lathan Watts in the studio. We'll get into this in more detail, because behind the scenes, Alliance Defending Freedom has been able to have some very significant successes in changing some of the policies, the internal policies of the bank. So just wanted you to know that is coming, and we'll talk about that more with Lathan Watts next week. We come back, we've got a lot to cover with Nathanael Blake. We'll be right back.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
We now have an opportunity to talk with Dr. Nathanael Blake. He is the author of this piece that comes from World Magazine, How to Live Under a Curse. Americans will not have more babies until they see the beauty in bearing another's burdens. Another very good article from World Magazine. Earlier in the week, we talked with one of the authors, Jenny Lynn Schmidt. Can classical liberalism be saved? So again, I would certainly encourage you to find out more about World Magazine. And Dr. Blake is the fellow in the Life and Family Initiative at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I first started working with the Ethics and Public Policy Center back there in 1979 and 1980 when I was at Georgetown. I do recommend them as well, and we have a link to their website at pointofview.net. Earned his PhD in political theory from a Catholic University, and one of the things that I think would also be helpful is his first book, Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. So, Dr. Blake, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's, we can talk just before we get into your article about the sexual revolution, because I noticed in some of the work that you've done, you've worked with, you've done studies on philosophers like Rousseau. And I was just thinking yesterday in the Breakpoint commentary, John Stonestreet talks about Rousseau and his terrible life, and even talks about another individual who we've had on the program, Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Apparently there's a meme going around saying that Glenn Sunshine said, if I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, Bin Laden, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I'd shoot Rousseau twice. And he says, no, I never said that, but quietly admits he does. It illustrates, I think, a point, and that is we are really affected by this sexual revolution. And we talk about the need for us to increase fertility and to deal with the baby bust that has taken place. And some of that goes back to your earlier book on terms of how the sexual revolution has affected us.
Yeah, so we can trace the philosophical lineage of some of these ideas. We can trace also the sociological lineage. And the point I make in my book is that the sexual revolution made a lot of promises to us as a culture, as individuals. It said we'd be happy, we'd be flourishing, we'd be authentically ourselves if we just abandoned all the old restraints, the old norms, and instead hopped in and out of relationships and beds and marriages and now even genders as we saw fit. And it just hasn't delivered. It has not provided happiness. It hasn't given us fulfillment. It has not even delivered on its promises of great sex. Americans are reporting being lonelier and having less sex. And of course, among the consequences of this, as you mentioned, is the baby bust. Americans, like so much of the rest of the world, are increasingly not having babies, not even enough to replace ourselves. We need, you need at least 2 babies per couple, per woman, and we're not doing that. And the problem is not just a material one, it's that people have bought into a false understanding of what brings fulfillment and happiness in this life.
So well said. And again, you start out by saying, if you want more babies, we need to learn how to live under a curse. And you talk about some of these conferences, what we call pro-natalist conferences, because there's been this idea that maybe we can encourage individuals to have more babies by providing financial benefits, but a lot of it is a cultural shift and a biblical admonition rather than a financial one. Can you explain?
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to say that there's no policy changes. I think, for instance, making it easier to build houses might help, right? But ultimately, we do have that issue of if men and women don't come together and get married, and instead just remain uncommitted, disconnected, maybe in and out of relationships, then they're not going to have children. And also, we have to reckon with the fact that men and women are different. And that should be the most obvious thing in the world to say. But in our culture, it seems almost radical, but it's true. Men and women are different. And part of that, as we know from Scripture, is that, well, the effects of children are different. Women bear more of those burdens than men do. And consequently, what we need is solidarity and complementarity, because if we simply say, well, the ideal person is an autonomous individual, well, that's going to hurt women the most, in the sense of they're the ones who bear the burdens of childbirth, of pregnancy more. And if they're expected to be just like men, then they're disadvantaged. So one of the things we really have to address is, well, how do we teach men and women, and in particular teach men to treat women with love and compassion and solidarity and complementarity, particularly when it comes to having children? Because that, if a woman doesn't feel supported, if she doesn't feel safe, well, which is, of course, what the sexual revolution has produced in all of these temporary and uncertain relationships, she's not going to want to have babies. Men, of course, aren't going to want to have children if they feel like their relationship with the mother of their children, if their relationship with their children is unsettled. So really, we need that permanence. We need that commitment provided by marriage traditionally to help encourage that. People will not have more babies just because it's good for the nation, and the GDP will be a bit higher in 30 years.
Again, this is an article was in World Magazine, and we've posted it there for you to find. Of course, if you get World Magazine, you will already perhaps have seen it, How to Live Under a Curse. And by that, of course, we recognize that in Genesis 3, it's the curse of childbearing. But you go on to point out that it isn't just that, as you are already alluding to, because, as you say, children are not only vulnerable and dependent in their own right, they make their mothers more dependent and vulnerable, especially during pregnancy and childbirth. So if we are saying, I'm an autonomous individual, and I certainly recognize how it would be important for us to replace our population, which we're not doing. There's still a tendency for people to say, well, I'll let someone else do it because I've got a career, I've got bodily autonomy, or in some cases, as you just pointed out, I don't have a mate. And I really hadn't thought about how one issue we talk about, and that is the birth dearth, is related to the other issue we talk about, and that is social media. And we've been doing some programs lately on the so-called anxious generation, because in some respects that is, again, one of the things that's resulted. But if you aren't dating and you aren't considering having children, whether you're married or not, the pro-natalist argument really kind of fades on the sidelines, doesn't it?
It does. So one of the things we've seen is that the number of children being born out of wedlock has gone down, and that's good. The problem, though, is that we're not having enough people get married, so not enough children are being born in wedlock. Right. And as you mentioned, people aren't dating. We've got, I don't know what's going on with Gen Z at this point, but there's that meme that goes around. If you're a millennial or whomever, at this point, we're getting older, and you're happily married, you feel like you caught the last chopper out of Vietnam. And I think that meme gets at something true, which is that we've lost the scripts. We've lost sort of that cultural memory of how young men and women even come together. And so that's a whole thing that needs to be addressed. And I do think the church in particular can work to address that, because the church knows what we're meant for. It can say, look, you are meant to come together. And it's also a place of accountability. Right? The dating app world is a world where there's not a lot of accountability if young men treat young women badly, or the reverse. But church can say, actually, this is a community, and therefore, there's accountability. There is a sense of trust that can be engendered there. And it's also a place where good relationships can be modeled. So as bad as the dating scene is, I do think that gives the church a tremendous opportunity to help form and direct and shape young men and women to find these relationships of marriage and family that most of us are called to in this life.
And again, this is back to our point. I'm going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into this a little bit more, but it's the cultural issues we're talking about. And I appreciate the fact that you recognize that oftentimes women are dealing with some of the physical hardships, maybe even handicaps, what that might do and affect her career and education. But as you just pointed out, the other part of that, and a very significant part of that, is many men, you said, rather than being dependable and protective, are oftentimes abusive abusive, exploitative, or absent. And that is certainly the other aspect of that. And I think it does illustrate that this is something that the church can and should do. And sometimes when we do talk about the birth dearth or the baby bust or whatever it might be, I have people coming up to me and saying, well, I don't see that in my own church here because we're breaking out at the seams in terms of the young couples and all of the rest. But nevertheless, even if we do see a fertility gap between the world and what's happening sometimes in the church, even inside the church, there is a lot that can and should take place. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation as we talk about this very good article that appeared in World Magazine, How to Live Under a Curse. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue for a few more minutes with Nathanael Blake, I should say. And Dr. Blake is with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, has written this piece that appeared in World Magazine in July, How to Live Under a Curse. Americans will not have more babies until they see the beauty in bearing another's burdens. And I thought for just a minute, Nathanael, we might even talk to pastors and Christian leaders and Sunday school teachers, because in some respects, this is what we can and should be doing inside the church. And as you point out, love is how we live with the curse. Love is how and why we welcome babies as blessings. And for people that are maybe looking for a key verse, one comes to mind, Psalm 127, verse 3, that children are a gift from the Lord. They are reward from Him. At a time when so many of these YouTube and TikTok videos talk about, I am so grateful I have no children because I have so much free time, and even making fun of people that have children and families, we need to counter program and come back to scriptural principles about the fact that children are a blessing from the Lord.
That's exactly right. And I think we can also point out that they're a blessing from the Lord because people are what we are meant for. Love is what we are made for, and that has been damaged by our sinfulness, by the sinfulness of the world. But we can still, through God's grace, work to counter that and to recapture what we were meant to be, which is people who are in relation with each other, who love each other, and in particular, men and women loving each other in that bond of marriage, which is not only a wonderful intimacy in this life, but which points us, it is a sign, it is a symbol of our ultimate fulfillment and our union with Christ. Scripture repeatedly uses marriage as a symbol of our relationship with Christ. And likewise with children, new persons, it's incredible. We can beget and conceive and raise new people who can love God, know God, enjoy God forever. That is a remarkable responsibility and privilege. It is one of the highest callings that we can have in this life, to care for new people, new immortal souls that will live forever. It's just remarkable and amazing, and we don't think about it in those terms because we're so busy with diapers and dishes and all the cares of this life. But it is something that is beautiful, and it is also something that is very fulfilling despite all those tasks of life. Because again, the pleasures of life, whatever they are, the material pleasures, the pleasures of status, do not fulfill us in the way that other people are, because people are inexhaustible. Persons are what we are meant to be in relation with and find pleasure and joy from above everything else. And of course, ultimately, that is the person of God above all. But there is something where we can say, look, yeah, it's not as glitzy and glamorous, but it is more beautiful, it is more loving, it is a satisfaction that isn't exhausted. Instead, it endures and it grows deeper.
And again, as we've just talked about here, children are a blessing. And it seems to me that so often it's been portrayed as a burden or a financial or even environmental risk. I mean, I remember one of my main professors, one of the founders of zero population growth, and the idea that you can't bring more children into the world because it will strain the resources and all the rest. But you do talk about something else, because in addition to the idea of babies being a blessing, let's face it, there is a sense in which they are a burden, because you say love means bearing each other's burdens in a complementary partnership that counters the curse, not a domination that entrenches it. And it seems to me that I just gave, of course, Psalm 127, but bear one another's burdens. How about Galatians 6, verse 2, where we are told to bear one another's burdens. So both blessing and burden, and in a sense, that's the twofold kind of message that you have to individuals who are saying, well, we do need to have more children. We need to replace our population, but we're not going to achieve that by passing some particular law, but I think we achieve it by coming back to some of these key biblical principles about children being a blessing. And even when they're difficult, the burden is something that we should be willing to bear as a believer. Your thoughts?
I think that's absolutely right. And I would, in particular, emphasize or return back to something you said earlier, which is to talk about men being supportive and dependable and faithful. And that in particular is something that is lacking in so much of our culture,
Yes.
and that really discourages people, and particularly women, from wanting to have children. And that is where the church, we talked about it a little bit, but just emphasize the church can step in, encourage young men to be that sort of man before they get married, before they settle down, and they will be positioned to be the fathers, to be the leaders of their household, and providing the support that their wives need, whatever that support is, as they embark upon having children together. It will make it so much more attractive to have children when there is that dependable, reliable male faithfulness and leadership in the household.
Let me again just encourage you to find this article and maybe pass it around. We do have a link to the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and that's eppc.org. Very simple. You will see articles there by people that we've interviewed on this program, like Carl Truman and Andrew Walker, of course, Nathanael Blake, including another one that he's written about, a New York Times author who destroyed her marriage and then wonders where the good men went, and a variety of others. And of course, you can find out more about his book, Victims of the Revolution. So I certainly appreciate you writing this article, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me on.
We are going to come back and spend some time getting into a couple of other issues. Agustin Forzani will be with us. He is another one of those young voices, and we'll get a chance to hear from him on the Defense Department budget. And then we'll get back into some other issues, very good pieces that have come out today by Victor Davis Hanson and Stanley Kurtz. I hope we'll be able to get to both of them, but we'll just see how that unfolds as time goes on. But if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to find some of these articles, we certainly have posted them on our website, pointofview.net. We have my Viewpoints commentary today talking about children of liberal parents. This comes from an individual by the name of Dr. Leonard Sachs, in which he has concluded that it used to be true that whether you had conservative parents or liberal parents, kids turned out about the same. No longer. There is something in the liberal mindset today that has caused some real problems, and a lot of that can be documented in the book that we've talked about before with Jonathan Haidt, Coddling of the American Mind. So you might want to find that commentary and pass that on to individuals as well. But you'll also notice that we have a banner there, and the banner is, again, a picture of a $10 bill, picture of Alexander Hamilton on that, in which we suggest that you might want to give $10 today. Now, I recognize that some of you that are listening to this program, about 1% of you that listen to the program already support this ministry. Not really talking to you other than to say thank you for your support. But I am talking for just a minute about the other, about 99% of you that have been listening to Point of View for some time, listen every day or just now have started listening, and you may not be aware of the fact that we're listener supported. And so we thought during the month of August, we might just have a $10 campaign. Pretty straightforward. And that is, if you have never given before, can I just ask you to maybe think about chipping in $10? Doesn't take much, but every bit will help. If you click on the button there, you can see you can, of course, do more than $10. We've got buttons there for 10 or 15, 25, whatever. But your gift would be greatly appreciated. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the defense budget, and there are some very good reasons for that. First of all, it is a huge bureaucracy. The Pentagon is enormous. The budget itself is enormous, although, as we pointed out before, the interest on the debt is actually now larger than the Defense Department budget, at least on paper. We'll get into some of the technicalities of that in just a minute, which is all the more reason to say maybe we need to reevaluate how much money we're spending. Earlier this week, we did talk about the fact that when we spend money in the Defense Department for some of these big budget items, those can be easily taken down by things like drones. And so there's kind of a rethinking about what that might entail as well. We've been privileged to have with us in studio a couple of times Pete Hegseth, who's now the Secretary of Defense. Back then, we didn't know that would be the position he would be in, but we wanted to give you a better perspective on that. So we come to another one of these young voices. We have a couple of individuals we've called on a regular basis, part of the organization called Young Voices, and one of those is Agustin Forzani. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from the National University in Argentina, a master's degree in economics from George Mason University, and has written this piece that appears in American Thinker. It is our third article there on the website. I guess it'd be actually technically the fourth article, since we covered one other issue earlier, and it is called The Real Cost of the Defense Budget. So, Agustin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me, and also hi to the audience out there.
Let's, if we can, start with your opening statement, and that is the United States is ramping up defense spending to nearly $1 trillion, despite claims to the contrary. It does seem to me that a lot of people say, well, no, I looked at the base budget, and, I mean, it's not small. It's $848 billion. But then you go, yeah, but forget about the fact that we also have money from the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. So give us some accounting here. It seems to me we're spending more on defense than we realized we were spending.
Yes, the thing is, and also this always happens, you know, the base budget for the Defense Department is, as you said, $848 billion, which is the highest of any other department in the government, you know, and compared to the last year budget, it's just a 2% increase, because last year was $831 billion. So some Republicans in the government, lawmakers are arguing that this is just a small increase, given the huge problems that we have, that the U.S. has to deal with, you know, in terms of geopolitics. You have like kind of two wars going on. So it seems a small increase, but you also have, as you said, you also have to add the $150 billion that was passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill, passed almost a month ago, which has some provisions that are defense related. Like, for example, money for shipbuildings, for creating a golden dome. The U.S. is apparently trying to create like a similar defense golden dome, similar to the one that Israel has, and other provisions for weapons. So if you include that, which is in the other this one big beautiful bill, you end up with almost $1 trillion of defense spending, which is a 20% increase compared to last year. So it's quite an increase, I would say.
Well, again, sometimes the accounting tricks are hidden. This one is pretty much out in the open if people want to read through this. You mentioned the Golden Dome. I might just mention my commentary last Friday, August 1st, was on the Golden Dome and the argument that was made years ago, since, again, we've been broadcasting at Point of View for more than 50 years, but especially during the 1980s was, well, this isn't going to work. It was dubbed as Star Wars. At the time, it was called the Strategic Defense Initiative. People made fun of it, but we now see what the Iron Dome in Israel does, and that as a way to protect us makes some sense. But again, one of the questions that I raised earlier in the week is when you are spending a lot of money and there isn't a great deal of accounting, and when you sometimes are spending money on big budget items that could be easily taken out by drones, as we have seen both in Ukraine and then how Israel used them against Iran, there probably is a greater need than ever to reevaluate the defense budget. So one of the things you take on is how you look at defense spending compared to GDP. Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, so that's the other point that I tried to make in the argument, that I mean, talking about the Golden Dome, in my article I don't try to argue against doing that or doing the other thing. I mean, this is just that I try to be objective, as far as I can, because nobody can do like a true objective analysis. But anyways, I try to say, you have to be careful with the spending that you do every year. Otherwise, it's gonna go like if you don't take accountability on this, it's a problem, And as James Madison said, you have to also check the military expenditure. Otherwise, it's gonna threaten the actual freedoms that you want to protect. But as you said, I make two arguments. First, we have to take into account that spending is increasing, like almost 20%, and the other argument is that it's not just as a percentage of GDP that you have to analyze defense spending, because if you select a specific indicator like that like spending, defense spending in as a ratio in the compared to GDP, well, yeah, defense spending is quite low compared to historic standards. But actually, you have other ways to measure the defense spending and how the government interacts in the economy, which maybe are not related to the amount that you spend as a percentage of GDP. For example, like the scope of the activities that you take into that the government
right.
takes carries out.
Let me jump in because I want to talk about that issue of scope, but we're coming up to a break. So let me come to a break and we'll come back and talk about the scope, because I want to give you some of those numbers from this article, which again would suggest President Trump, Secretary Hegseth, maybe we should roll back some of that. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dr. Leonard Sachs holds a PhD in psychology and has been a family doctor for nearly 34 years.
He said he never saw a correlation between politics and parenting until now. He said left-of-center parents were no better and no worse than parents on average than right-of-center parents. He has now documented that children of politically liberal parents are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety and a lack of sense of life meaning and have substance abuse issues. He's noted that over the past decade, there's been an increase in what he calls permissive parents. They have been persuaded to carry out more gentle parenting because they don't want to be controlling to their children. In most cases, the children become the authority while parents try to be patient, calm, and punishment-free. His story from an article in the Institute for Family Studies illustrates this only so well. A mom brought her 6-year-old daughter into the office with a fever and sore throat. He asked the girl to open her mouth and say, "Ah." She shook her head and clenched her mouth. He asked the mom for help. Instead, the mother merely replied, "Her body, her choice." NYU professor Jonathan Haidt has been on my radio program to talk about his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. He believes that the real reason that left-of-center kids are more likely to be depressed compared to right-of-center kids is that left-of-center kids have been taught to catastrophize events, to assume the worst, while right-of-center kids have been taught to be more optimistic. You know, what is taught at home and what is consumed on social media is having a negative impact on the minds and mental states of children and adolescents. Political views and mental health seem to be correlated more than ever. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Agustin Forzani with us. We're talking about the real cost of the defense budget, and it is, I think, helpful to understand that, in a sense, the budget really is $1 trillion, and if you add all of that together, whether it's the baseline budget, $848 billion, to about the $150 billion that was in the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, we're spending a lot of money, and it does seem to me that President Donald Trump, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and others need to figure out how to reduce, in some respects, the size and scope of this budget, and more importantly, to make sure that the dollars are spent in fighting the next war. As we talked about earlier in the week, sometimes the mistake, we've seen this before, we saw it in the Civil War, we saw it in World War I, of fighting the previous current war with previous war kind of ideas and strategies. But Agustin, you did bring up something about scope, and I wanted to get into that because that's another very helpful piece of your article, because you point out that since the Cold War, which ended in 1989 technically, the Pentagon has increased its operations from 40 countries in the 1990s to 80. So it virtually doubled the number of countries. At the same time, you have our U.S. Special Operation Forces, which have been deployed. It used to be in maybe 60 countries. Now that's expanded to 150 countries. And so it seems to me that if unchecked, we're going to eventually have military operations in almost every country in the world. And it does seem to me that we have heard from this president, we don't want to be the world's policeman, and yet we seem to be expanding more every single day. That seems to be what you found out with your research.
Yeah, that's true. Well, also the trigger of this article actually was an article that I read in the Wall Street Journal about, I think was a lawmaker that was saying basically that, the GDP ratio, the defense spending compared to the GDP ratio is like quite low in historic standards. And as I say also in the article, that's true. But you also have other indicators that show you that defense spending is actually doing fine. For example, as you mentioned, you have operations. The Pentagon is in almost 80 countries today, compared to the 90s, which was in half of those countries, and you have a special operation in 150 countries. It's quite a lot. Even though defense spending is lower today than in the 90s. Another agency which was actually created in the 40s were the CIA and the National Security Council. Those two agencies, which you can argue that are not that transparent, those were created in a time when defense spending was quite high in this ratio. This defense spending compared to the GDP was quite high and was decreasing over time. But still, you still have those agencies working today. So and actually, these kind of agencies are, as I said, not that transparent, that you never know how far they reach, in the investigations that they conduct. And another argument that you can make also is, all the aid that the U.S. provides to other countries, which President Trump is trying to reduce it, but you still have a huge amount. And there is another problem with spending a lot of money in defense and overseas, which is something that I didn't bring in the article because it was going to be too long. But you have the problem of like a boomerang effect, which is called. It's a problem that you end up having when you have military spending, and you increase the military spending, and you have operations overseas, and then all those materials that you use, the tanks, the weapons that you don't use anymore because you produce new weapons for those places. It's incredible that they end up being used for the police in the U.S. This is another problems that you have. There are certain municipalities in certain cities which the police has, tanks for combating, the civil, for maintaining the civil, like controlling the city. This is insane. It's not a weapon to use in your own people. That's another problem that you end up having when you keep increasing the defense spending. So I in this article, I don't want to argue that the U.S. should do this or should do that. I just want to point out that these are the problems that you end up having, and as a society, we have to decide what do we do with the money,
Very good. Well, I appreciate you writing the article, and you are one of the many young voices we've called upon. And if people would like to know more, we have this article from American Thinker, and it gets into some of the numbers that don't add up, some of the issues of the GDP misconception, you call it, some of the bottom line as well, and the need for us to be wise about the way in which we spend scarce financial resources, especially when it comes to the military. So, Agustin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing your article.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me just mention, just before we take a break, that I'm not against the military. Obviously, we are very for the military. But one thing that crossed my mind is how much, in light of reading some of this, we really needed DOGE to have spent some time in the Defense Department, which it did not, but how we could still maybe find some creative ways to deal with this. Years ago, those of you that listened to Point of View might remember that we used to have Representative Dick Armey on this program. He and Marlon Maddox got to be very good friends, and he came up with this idea of the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. And I thought it was very creative because one of the problems with the Defense Department is simply this. Everybody wants the Defense Department in their congressional district. And so as a result, there were many of these military bases that frankly just needed to be closed down. But nobody wanted to close them down because, after all, having a military base in the backyard of your congressional district is something that you would fight tooth and nail. So Dick Armey came up with an idea which I think we need to consider today when we look at the defense budget. And that is, he said, let's put together a commission, which was called the Base Realignment Closure Commission, and go through and evaluate all of these military bases in an objective way, and then submit those bases which need to be closed down, and only members of Congress could only vote up or down on the entire recommendation. Well, now you, if you were a member of Congress, would not be put in a position of closing down a military base in your own area. You wanted to close down many of those military bases. Everybody wants to close down a military base, but not the one in their own backyard. But when you put it that way, I think it began to have some cadence and some credence and really began to move the ball in the right direction. It wasn't perfect. I know that in some cases people look back and say that wasn't always that successful, but it was a way of maybe getting some objective eyes on this, because when you go from a time in which the Pentagon has had operations in 40 countries and now has it in 80, and when U.S. Special Operations not even just a few years ago was in, about 60 countries and now is in 150 countries, it's going the wrong direction. And we did elect President Trump, and we assumed that he would appoint a Secretary of Defense to try to figure out what we can do to begin to bring the defense budget under some kind of control. So I think that's a reasonable request. And so we wanted you to see one way of looking at some of the real cost in the defense budget, and so that maybe we can begin to exercise some fiscal responsibility when it comes to the Defense Department, especially given the fact that we do have, let's be honest, a military-industrial complex. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, let me just as a program note mention that tomorrow we're going to have Heather McDonald with us. We'll talk about her book briefly, When Race Trumps Merit. And one of the things we'll get into is the issue of DEI. And just down the road from us last night, the Fort Worth City Council had to decide whether or not they were going to disband their DEI program. And if they did not, they would probably lose about $77 million in federal grants. So obviously, you can imagine how that decision went. But it gets us into this issue of DEI. Also, I do want to ask Heather McDonald about the issue of how the press has been covering ICE, because as you've heard me mention, she was there and found a number of stories that were never covered by the press, which were very concerning. So we'll get into that, which also leads to, of course, a piece that we'll talk about before she comes on, in which the editors of National Review said ICE is not Gestapo, which is sort of obvious, but we'll get into that. And we'll also, of course, talk about the individuals, Democrats, that have been fleeing Texas, because then next hour we will have, for a while, Colonel Allen West. And I got a feeling he's going to have a few comments about that, as well as just he's been writing about the number of people in office that have broken their oath. You know, you're not supposed to break your oath when you serve in the military, which he did. You're not supposed to break your oath when you serve in government, which he has done, and so he's in a position really to address that issue. But I thought also, as a program note, in the last about half hour of tomorrow, two very good articles come out on socialism. One by our friend Jerry Newcomb, another one by John Stossel. So we're going to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into this issue of socialism. Of course, I have a booklet on capitalism and socialism. Also have another booklet on just socialism, the kinds of booklets you'd want to hand to a young person, maybe even some of the voters in the city of New York City. That's what John Stossel's writing about in terms of who his future mayor might be. So, again, that's just a program note for what will happening on Thursday. Then Friday, we have Dr. Merrill Matthews and Liberty McCarter. We're going to be talking about a number of issues, not the least of which is how Planned Parenthood has been defunded. And want to get some comments, obviously, from Liberty about that. And also a very good piece that we will post by Marjorie Dannenfelser on that subject. So quite a bit to cover, and in some respects that is a reason for optimism, which brings me to this next piece by Stanley Kurtz. I mentioned earlier that Nathanael Blake is with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I think I first met Stanley Kurtz through Heritage Foundation, but I'm pretty sure, if I'm right, he actually is now at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. But he's talking about the idea of a cultural comeback. Then after the break, we're going to hear from, of course, Victor Davis Hanson's piece, which talks about why that's happening. And part of that, of course, is President Trump. But Stanley Kurtz asked a very important question. Is woke dying? Are conservatives actually winning the culture wars? Questions like these have been kicking around since President Trump's reelection, and they've only grown more compelling when we begin to see how poorly the Democrats have been doing. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar, years ago, we interviewed a man by the name of James Davidson Hunter. I recommend any of his books, by the way, but he wrote a book in 1991 called Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. And he talked about some of the people who at that time were culture warriors, and the phrase culture warriors really sort of took off. I think, as a matter of fact, if I remember right, our good friend from Congress, and also having worked in the Nixon administration, Pat Buchanan actually used the phrase when he was running for the presidency. But anyway, if I remember right, and I mentioned he wasn't really a member of Congress, but he was mentioned member of the Nixon administration and others. But nevertheless, that phrase culture warrior really kind of stuck. And so that's what Stanley Kurtz is talking about. He says, now let's be optimistic, because I think this is an entirely plausible scenario. What if the current Trump administration were to be followed by a two-term Republican presidency? We saw a 12-year Republican streak like this when Ronald Reagan's two terms were followed by a single term by George Herbert Walker Bush. He says another triple Republican streak would yield, and this is his estimate, I think it's right, a likely 8-1 Supreme Court advantage for conservatives, and President Trump's recent flurry of executive orders would have been in effect now for 12 years, whether Congress converted them into law or not. And so he says, well over a decade, Lyndon Johnson's executive order establishing affirmative action would stand repealed, as would all federal support for DEI, which is, again, the topic we'll have tomorrow with Heather McDonald. The government would still be doing all of its power to both keep men out of women's sports and to end gender reassignment surgery. So, he's trying to give you, is it possible to really be optimistic about the future? I think some of the concerns that I have about the future are more economic rather than cultural, but we'll see. He says, but first of all, if all of this happens, it will have been for largely the same reason we got 3 consecutive Republican terms in 1980s and early 1990s, not to mention Republicans alternating with moderate Democrats with Richard Nixon through George W. Bush. The center-right presidencies of 1968 through 2007 were reactions to the excesses of the early and late 1960s, as embodied in the presidential candidacy of George McGovern. But he also points out that even though we had Republican presidents, some of those didn't change. He says, for example, Richard Nixon, despite all of his rhetoric, actually advanced Lyndon Johnson's policy of affirmative action. Ronald Reagan considered revoking Johnson's executive order on preferences, but defenders of affirmative action both outside and inside Reagan's administration prevented this. So as much as many people love to talk about what was accomplished during the Reagan administration, that was not one of those. He then goes on to explain, President Trump, by contrast, has uprooted Johnson's original affirmative action executive order, and for the first time has linked a conservative program of higher education reform to the continued receipt of federal dollars. Federal levers of power have been used across the entire range of culture war issues, often for the very first time on behalf of conservative goals. And so he then, of course, explains this idea of culture wars and James Davidson Hunter's book, and then points out that we've also seen some things that have been developing even more recently, and one of those is the case of Mahmoud versus Taylor, which we've talked about, in which the Supreme Court did argue that you can opt out of particular things that were being taught in the schools against your religious convictions. And more importantly, also points out that the movement for school choice has really taken off rather dramatically. So then he goes back and recognizes that on some of these cultural issues, it's been sort of a mixed bag. He says, for example, court-imposed gay marriage is now the law of the land. This has given rise, he points out, to the transgender movement until recently seemed to be inevitable, but when you have now, as we've pointed out, the overreach and the attempt to try to have men and girls sports, gender transition surgery, and the rest, that has really changed. You also, of course, on the issue of abortion, have the Dobbs decision of 2022. Even though abortion is still somewhat a practice, and significantly so, we'll get into some of the things Marjorie Dannenfelser talks about on Friday, that is the case. But we also see that some of the so-called culture wars have moved beyond abortion and homosexuality to things like immigration. And this is, again, one where I think Democrats oftentimes find themselves on the losing end, because providing cities for illegal immigrants, sanctuary cities, open borders, even some of the texts, as we'll talk about tomorrow, on ICE, which we'll also talk about with Heather McDonald, I think illustrate the fact that things have changed rather dramatically. So then he comes and says, well, our conservatives winning the culture war. And he said maybe right now it's tied, because they're certainly winning the controversies, but the left still controls the levers of cultural power, what's going on in the universities and things of that nature. And, of course, points out that even the sexual revolution, as we talked about just a few minutes ago with Nathanael Blake, are having a devastating impact on marriage and child rearing. But nevertheless, if you wanted to be somewhat optimistic, and I try to be optimistic around here, in some respects, the culture wars that looked almost unwinnable 2 decades ago are actually beginning to be won at a variety of different levels. And he begins to think about, what would it be like if you have a, say, President J.D. Vance and a Vice President Marco Rubio, or flip the two, that might continue for a while, and it could turn this country around in ways that people really didn't see coming just even a few years ago. So if you'd like to read this, it is a fascinating piece by Stanley Kurtz, and it's on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about some of these cultural changes. Some of that has to do, obviously, with President Donald Trump. And so I thought we would end with this piece by Victor Davis Hanson. And if you read through it, it's going to sound a little bit familiar because I was just going back and finding the piece that I wrote on July 28th. My commentary is entitled Failed Experts, because I was quoting from a piece there by Victor Victor Davis Hanson called The Decline and Fall of Our So-Called Degreed Experts. Came out on the 4th of July, and in some respects there's an overlap. It's almost like part 1 and 2. And so let me end with this, and that is, he says, Trump's unknown frontiers. Donald Trump is rewriting the rules of politics, economics, and culture, and no one, not even the experts, of course he's already said that, knows what happens when the old orthodox finally breaks. And he's pointed out the fact that if you want to borrow a phrase from Star Trek, man, I got to love the fact that Victor Davis Hanson at least knows the phrase from Star Trek, to boldly go where no one has gone before. That is exactly what President Trump has done. Because he says no conservative president has dared to question the last 70 years of progressive cultural, social, economic, and political dominance, all traditional wisdom, all of the renowned experts, self-described authorities who have no credibility. If you see an overlap between this one and the one by Stanley Kurtz, who's at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, I don't know if the two of them know each other, but they're singing off almost the same song sheet, even though Stanley Kurtz is in Washington, D.C., and Victor Davis Hanson is in Palo Alto, California. I suspect they've crossed paths many times. But the point he's making is this. We've heard from our legacy media, for example, that we're going to have a disastrous economy, that the United States Air Force better not enter into Iranian airspace. We see how that worked out. He says, well, just take the border. You know, we were told that comprehensive immigration reform was the only way we could deal with 10,000 foreign nationals storming the border during peak surges in the Biden administration. But guess what? And he gives us 6 reasons why that's different. No president has, number 1, pressured Mexico to close its borders and patrol ours. Number 2, announced a plan to complete a border wall along the entire U.S.-Mexico border. Number 3, stopped catch and release. Number 4, ceased refugee applications after illegal entering the U.S. Number 5, introduced policies encouraging voluntary self-deportation. And 6, prevented all illegal entries at the border. And so as a result, what has that done? Well, we talked about the jobs report the other day. He's got the numbers. 1 million foreign nationals have lost their jobs, and 2 million Americans have gained their jobs since Trump's inauguration. Well, what would that mean for the culture? How much trauma and costs will be avoided if 500,000 criminal aliens are deported? How many serious and lethal hit-and-run accidents will be prevented? How many emergency rooms will have more space for U.S. citizens? No one knows, but the consequences, he says, could be enormous. What about the tariffs? Well, we've talked about these before because, again, we were told the tariffs would destroy the economy. We'd have a recession, a stock collapse, stagflation. But guess what? We found out some of these importers pay a 15% tariff, still make a handsome profit, and don't necessarily always raise the costs on the U.S. consumer. And here we find ourselves. And we actually wonder whether or not moderate tariffs encourage rather than retard American enterprise. And that has certainly been the case. No one really knows the answers to some of this right now because we've never tried this before. But again, to boldly go where no one has gone before. What about these $2 trillion budget deficits? Well, if these tariffs bring in some of that, maybe that solves some of that problem. But again, isn't it possible we can begin to grow the economy? Because he says never has the government promised to deregulate and fast-track permits for construction, energy development, manufacturing from 2 to 3 years to just mere months. What could possibly be the financial consequences of that? Then he quotes from Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, who suggests that $15 trillion in foreign investments are coming quite soon. What might that mean? Is it possible, he says, that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent could be right that $300 billion in federal income could come from new tariffs? If true, that would reduce the deficit by 15%. And of course, he says then when we look at the universities, which is something he talks about so often, nobody's really questioned universities. And now we wonder about whether or not we can begin to address this issue of student loan debt that is spiraled to $1.7 trillion. Graduation rates have dropped dramatically. And so as a result, maybe when the government is now starting to hold universities responsible, as we talked about earlier in this week, maybe some of that would change. What about ending this idea of segregated dorms, safe spaces, affinity graduations? Couldn't that lead to more integration and assimilation? And what about maybe having admissions, which we're going to talk about tomorrow with Heather McDonald, based upon meritocracy rather than rewarding those who maybe have the right particular ethnic background? How about rewarding those who study hard and because of that encourage others to do the same and study hard? And maybe fewer administrators, more emphasis on instruction, less on politics, might really be a good thing for the university. And then finally, as he talked about affirmative action, something I just talked about a minute ago, of course, with Stanley Kurtz, gets into that issue, which I'll just simply ignore, and mention finally that when we even get into foreign policy, for the last 30 years, NATO was basically hollowed out. Most NATO members did not meet their commitments. Now they have met their commitments, and that has changed rather dramatically. We were told that you better steer clear of Iran because this supposedly unhinged lethal bully in the Middle East is one that would be very dangerous. And yet today what we see is some of those killer surrogates like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis either don't exist or have gone underground. And turns out that some of the threats were maybe just more than idle threats. So if nothing else, he's pointing out the fact that if anything right now, we're seeing some remarkable changes. Nobody knows what the long-term implications might be. But again, there's reason for maybe a little bit of belief in some optimism. And I thought we'd close with those two pieces by Stanley Kurtz and Victor Davis Hanson. And if you'd like to maybe pass those on to some others that maybe are a little bit down and discouraged, I think you're going to find that these are two seminal thinkers from really two different areas of the country with two very different academic backgrounds who nevertheless are pointing to some reasons for optimism in the future. But just before we go off the air, one last time, as we've mentioned before, we are a listener-supported program, and so we would encourage you to think about how you maybe have benefited, and can maybe I ask you to pay it forward. This would be an opportunity for your gift to allow us to keep bringing these programs on the air to influence others in the future. And so your $10 gift, it's not a lot, but I'd encourage you, if you've never given before, to chip in. It's a way in which you can say, you know, I really appreciate what you're covering here on Point of View. I will continue to listen, and I do want to at least send you $10 to say thank you for what you're doing indeed. Again, all of the information that you might need for the conversations we've had today is on the website at pointofview.net. You can also, of course, click on that button that says Give Now. And I want to thank Megan again for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Heather McDonald, Colonel Alan West, lots of great information right here on Point of View.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.